All right, y'all. So today we're going to start digging into this concept of symbiosis, or another term that we use for that is ecological relationships. This is the idea that within an ecosystem, the organisms share different relationships with other organisms. And these different relationships have classifications based on what the effect is for those organisms that are involved. Generally, when we talk about relationships, we kind of consider them to either be good, bad, or neutral. Okay, and we'll kind of see those different classifications today as we move through these different examples. So the first form of relationship that we're going to look at is what we call competition. Okay, and this is probably something very familiar to all of you in regards to what it is, and that is simply it occurs when two organisms try to use the same resource at the same time. Okay, now within an ecosystem there are many resources, right? And a resource generally is something that we're referring to that is limited, that organisms need to survive, right? A good kind of funny thing to think about when it comes to ecology, there's two things that organisms always want to do. It's survive and have sex, right? Because if they're surviving, they're eating, right? They're able to continue to live. And if they can find a mate and they can have sex, they can reproduce, right? And continue their lineage, right? And that is the goal of most organisms. So when it comes to competition, those resources can be food, water, but also a mate, right? That could be another resource among many other things. We think of competition more in regards to sports, right? When you compete against somebody else, you're trying to get that prize at the end, right? So with competition in the wild, so to say, in an ecosystem, it's the same thing. You're trying to get one resource, okay? Within this example of a relationship, we classify this as being a negative effect on both organisms. Okay, so there's going to be two different kind of symbols that we use to describe the effects of these relationships, and that is smiley faces and then plus, minus, and equal signs. Okay, so for competition, we would have two frowning faces, sad faces, right? Because within competition, neither organism is coming out on top, right? Because they're constantly fighting over that resource, and at some point this organism is going to be short, and at some point this organism is going to be short. So generally we refer to competition as being a negative relationship. Okay, an example would be two lizards competing to eat the same insect, right? Or you could say two peacocks competing to get a mate. Okay. So the second type of relationship that we have is predation, okay, and this is something you are very familiar with as well, predator-prey relationships, right? So that's an interaction in which one organism captures and feeds on another organism, okay? So you think about, lions in the safari, right? Lions and gazelles, okay? So the lions are the predator and they're preying on the gazelle. Okay, so within this relationship, you're going to have one organism that is really happy, and you're going to have one organism that is not, right? And so that would be a positive and a negative relationship because the predator is getting the food, they're getting what they need to survive, and that is good, they want that, whereas the prey is getting killed. So they're going to be that negative, sad organism in this example. An example in the wild would be an anglerfish luring and eating a smaller fish. In people, this could be, think about it, you eat animals and plants all the time. So you are technically a predator. So when you eat a salad, your prey is the plants that you ate. So you see it all the time, okay? Predation, whether it be in the wild or whether it be in your house, it's happening all the time. So those are two kind of big relationships that we see all the time. Okay. And then additionally to those, we have this idea of symbiosis. Okay. And this is an interaction between two organisms. Okay. And so we designate this a little bit differently than those two relationships. And as you see, the definition here is any relationship in which two species live closely together. Okay, and that's the key, is that they are closely together. Okay, so within this idea of symbiosis, there are three types of relationships that we're going to have. Okay, so symbiosis is kind of the umbrella term, and then there's three types of relationships underneath that. Okay, that go side by side with competition and predation. Okay, so the first symbiosis, or the first symbiotic relationship, is what we call mutualism. Okay, now notice the term mutual. Okay, mutual, something that is mutual generally means that two people or two things are mutually together, right? So a mutualistic relationship is a relationship where both organisms benefit. Okay, so when we look at our smiley faces or pluses and minuses, this is going to be both organisms are happy, both organisms are benefiting. Okay, so an example of this would be insects pollinating flowers. The insects benefit by receiving food, right? And the flowers, they benefit by reproducing, right? Because the pollinating is what allows them to reproduce. So this would be a mutualistic relationship. A people example would be, let's say you and a friend study together for a test, right? You're both giving knowledge and giving energy and giving each other support to get what you want, right? So inevitably that should ideally, hopefully, mutually affect both of you positively. Okay, so in a mutualistic relationship, you're going to have both organisms positively affected. Okay, the second type of symbiotic relationship, we have commensalism. Okay, commensalism. Okay, and what this means is it's a relationship where one member benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So one is benefiting and then the other is unaffected. Okay, so you see our smiley faces. We have one that's happy, one that's whatever. Or we would say that this is a positive relationship and then a neutral relationship, which we could use an equal sign to designate as well. Okay, so an example of this would be orchids growing in a tree benefit from runoff and sunlight, but do not harm the tree. So this is where one organism, I'm actually going to use a better example that's probably more prominent to you guys. Think of the, you've always seen in the safari, right, with the elephants or with rhinoceroses or whatever, they always have birds on them, right? And the birds are eating the bugs off of the large animal, the elephant or whatever it is, right? So the bird is benefiting because it's getting food, whereas the elephant or whatever is unaffected, right? The bird doesn't bother the elephant. It's not hurting it. It's not helping it. But because the elephant stinks, the bird's getting plenty of food. So that would be an example of a commensalism relationship. So one benefits, the other is whatever, unaffected, right? So the last relationship that we have is parasitism. So this is a parasite. Which most of us have probably heard of before. So this is a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits and the other is harmed, right? So this is ticks feeding on a dog's blood, right? The tick is benefiting because it's getting the nutrients, right? It's surviving, whereas the dog is getting its blood taken, right? And so a lot of times with parasites, it might not necessarily kill an organism, but it's going to be draining it of its nutrients. Okay, so and you'll see that in a lot of the examples that you see in your assignments this week. So with parasitism, you have a positive relationship with one organism and then a negative. So it's a positively affected and a negatively affected organism in this example. So within those relationships, okay, it's important to note that there are three types of symbiotic relationships. All that means is that they are closely together. They have to live in the same area. They have to live together. They're interacting together all the time, right? Whereas the other two those, as far as predation and competition, they don't have to necessarily be interacting together continuously. That's why they're separate. But when we talk about ecological relationships, there's 5 big forms of relationships, 5 types of relationships, and that is competition, predation, mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Okay, so through this week's assignments, you're going to be looking at a lot of examples of these. There's a handful of videos that you're going to kind of click through and watch as far as examples, and then you're going to be asked to come up with examples from your everyday life. Okay, so you're going to see some in the wild examples, and then I want you to think about how do those examples relate to what you face every day. Okay, and the big thing to remember is just think about these positive and negative, positively, negatively, or neutrally affected examples. Okay, so just kind of keep in mind of what is happening in each of those relationships with organism 1, organism 2, as far as whether they're positively affected, negatively affected, or neutral, or unaffected, as we would say. Okay, that is it for now. You're going to kind of deal with this stuff for most of this week, and then we'll kind of move into the next phase of looking at when we have these relationships, how does that affect the populations and the growth of those populations within these ecosystems. Okay, so as always, if you have any questions, please email me, let me know. I'll get you taken care of rather quickly. Just make sure you communicate. Again, the assignments for this week, if you can't get them done on the due date, just make sure you get them done and then email me when they are submitted. Otherwise, I will not know. Okay, so the deadlines are loose, but don't get so far behind that you can't get caught back up. Okay, have a wonderful week. I hope all of you are doing really well. And like always, email me if you have any questions.